Hello everyone to another video/audio lecture. If you are watching this on YouTube, that means you probably are not a Patreon supporter, and you should totally be a Patreon supporter where you willingly give me money and I provide you with different sort of content that you may be interested in. So this is a video that was actually recommended by one of my Patreon supporters and good friends, Caleb Knight, and he asked for me to do a video on Bonhoeffer and the death of God theologians. So I'm going to talk about who Bonhoeffer was, who are the death of God theologians, and then I'm going to talk about one critique that people have made, and I hold as well, that people have made of the death of God theologians' use of Bonhoeffer. And then I'm going to talk about two approvals that I have of the way that death of God theologians use Bonhoeffer. So before we get into all of those critiques and approvals, let me talk about the background of Bonhoeffer and the background of the death of God theologians. So Bonhoeffer was a early 20th century German theologian who sort of traveled between Germany and America and then ultimately ended up in Germany. And long story short, was a critic of the German church in the way that it co-opted itself with the Nazi regime. Eventually, he was so frustrated and so abhorrently opposed to the Nazi regime that he conspired, along with a number of other people, to kill Hitler. The Nazi regime eventually got wind of this and he ended up not being killed. Hitler ended up not being killed, and Bonhoeffer was placed in prison. While in prison, Bonhoeffer wrote a number of letters back and forth with a number of people, and that's where I think a lot of his work was the most radical and so interesting. And 2 days before the American troops, the American military, entered into Germany and restored freedom to not only all the people who were imprisoned, such as the Jews and a number of the other people that the Nazi regime who had imprisoned, Bonhoeffer and his camp was liberated. But 2 days prior to that liberation, Bonhoeffer was executed. So he was 39 years old, and he sort of lives in his mythos currently. I mean, he really is an important figure for many, many Christians, especially many Protestant Christians. Some background on the death of God theologians. These were a number of theologians and philosophers that sort of came around in the 60s and 70s, and they posited that traditional ways of believing in God, traditional theism, had been abandoned, and that there was an increased rise of secularity. And the death of God theologians sort of wanted to account for that philosophically and theologically. And a number of folks that were in sort of influences on the death of God theology, mainly Thomas Altheiser was a huge name, Mark Taylor was another huge name, Paul Van Buren and William Hamilton, and then later on, death of God theology, which is not unrelated to radical theology, but is a little different than radical theology. Eventually, radical theologians came on a little later, with probably the biggest name being John Caputo, which my friend Caleb Knight is a huge Caputo fan, and I'm a big Peter Rollins fan, and Peter Rollins is kind of thrown in that category as well. So those are the death of God theologians, and that's kind of their background. Let me talk about some of the critiques, or the one critique that is often made about the way death of God theologians utilize Bonhoeffer. And then I'm going to sort of first talk about or read a quote from Bonhoeffer, talk about it a bit, and then sort of get into the critique. So listen to what Bonhoeffer says. This is in Letters and Papers. This is probably around a year before he was killed by the Nazi regime. So listen what he says here. So our coming of age leads us to a true recognition of our situation before God. God would have us know that we must live as men who manage our lives without him. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. The God who lets us live in the world without the working hypothesis of God is the God before whom we stand continually. Before God and with God, we live without God. God lets himself be pushed out of the world onto the cross. He is weak and powerless in the world, and that is precisely the way, the only way, in which he is with us and helps us. In Matthew 18, Matthew makes it quite clear that Christ helps us, not by virtue of his omnipotence, but by the virtue of his weakness and suffering. So in this quote, Bonhoeffer talks about how God dies in this world, powerless and weak, and how that shouldn't be a movement away from why we would want to worship this God, to follow this God, but is actually precisely the reason why we would want to worship and follow this God, is because this God is a God that enters into the brokenness of the world and experiences brokenness to the point of death. Death of God theologians took this concept of Bonhoeffer and sort of took the maybe metaphoric or the figurative language that Bonhoeffer was using about how God sort of died to God's self, that God died powerless and in suffering. And they sort of took it more literally, that a metaphysical God had metaphysically died. Thomas Altheiser is a person that sort of took it more literal, and it really sort of meant in a literal way that God had truly died. He kind of famously says that God has literally died, and in the moment of the incarnation, and especially the moment of the crucifixion, is the moment that God died. And so Altheiser used the death of God language less metaphorically and more literally. And this is where I think Bonhoeffer scholars that critique death of God theologians' use of Bonhoeffer is probably correct. I don't think Bonhoeffer would ever have gone that far to say that God has metaphysically died, that there was a metaphysical death of God. I don't think Bonhoeffer would ever go that far. I think Bonhoeffer was remaining a theologian on the cross, if you will, with the cross, the theology of the cross being a really important aspect to Bonhoeffer's theology. I think that's what Bonhoeffer is trying to get here in this quote that I just read. And I don't think that Bonhoeffer really ever meant a literal metaphysical death of God. And so I think in that way, the death of God theologians utilize language that Bonhoeffer was using, but sort of twisted it in their own way to sort of support their purposes. And by that time, I mean, this would have been 20 or so years after Bonhoeffer's death that death of God theologians were using Bonhoeffer. And by that time, the sort of mythos of Bonhoeffer had already sort of begun, that there was this person who was killed by the Nazi regime, and that sort of gave Bonhoeffer a lot of support for his work, and again created a sort of mythos behind him. And so if you use Bonhoeffer, right, like you often are seen as using somebody that is important. So if you're using Bonhoeffer, then you must be saying something important. And I think that's what maybe the death of God theologians are doing here, to support their literal metaphysical death of God by using Bonhoeffer. But I don't think Bonhoeffer would have ever gone that far, and certainly is not what he's meaning here in this quote from Letters and Papers. So I think that's the main critique, and I think this critique is made by James Cone, the famous Black liberation theologian who just recently passed away. And James Cone, I don't know exactly the full quote that he used and the full context in which he was using or was critiquing the death of God theologians, but I know that James Cone was certainly a critic of the death of God theology, and one of those reasons is this very fact that he believes, as well as many Bonhoeffer scholars, that the death of God theologians were using Bonhoeffer's understanding of a God who forsakes God's self as a literal metaphysical death is just an overstep of what Bonhoeffer really meant. So I think that's a fair critique of the way death of God theologians utilize Bonhoeffer. But I do think there's a few things that the death of God theologians got right about Bonhoeffer. And let me read another quote from Bonhoeffer. Again, another one from Letters and Papers. I think Letters and Papers is not only my favorite work of Bonhoeffer, but it was where Bonhoeffer expressed a true radical sort of theology, a theology that really matters in the political world, and definitely moved away from more of the pious writings that a lot of evangelicals really appreciate, such as Cost of Discipleship and Life Together. So let me read the first approval that I would say that the death of God theologians got right about Bonhoeffer, and that is that the sort of death of God in a metaphorical sense for Bonhoeffer was that meant that we need to give ourselves to the world. And I think they got that right. So I'm going to read this Bonhoeffer quote, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. So Bonhoeffer suggests redemption myths try unhistorically to find an eternity after death. Redemption means that redemption cares about distress, it cares about fears and longings, and from sin and death, and it cares about a better world that is beyond the grave. But is this really the central character of the proclamation of Christ in the Gospels and by Paul? I should not say it is. The difference between the Christian hope of resurrection and the mythological hope is that the former sends a person back into the life of earth in a wholly new way. The Christian, unlike the devotees of the redemption myths, has no last line of escape available from earthly tasks and difficulties into the eternal. But like Christ himself, he, the Christian, must drink the earthly cup to the dregs, and only in his doing so is the crucified and risen Lord with him, and he crucified and risen with Christ. This world must not be prematurely written off in this Old and New Testaments are at one. So what Bonhoeffer's getting here is that one needs to, the Christian, the Christ event is a event that incites into the Christian one who gives oneself to the world. I think that Bonhoeffer's cares and concerns about his Jewish neighbors really comes into full effect here. Bonhoeffer wouldn't have said this if he didn't truly care about the people that the Nazi regime was killing and oppressing. Bonhoeffer knew the severity of the oppression that the Nazi regime was placing upon Jews and other people, so much so that Bonhoeffer, after a huge struggle with some of his pacifist leanings, said, something needs to happen. And if that means that a person needs to die, especially the person who is instigating all of it needs to die, then I will enter into that world fully and make that happen. Now, Hitler was never killed, but Bonhoeffer was placed in prison. But Bonhoeffer knew that that was what may have to happen, that Bonhoeffer may be imprisoned at best or killed at worst, and both ended up happening. And Bonhoeffer knew that that meant an entering into the world, entering into suffering in prison and to the brokenness of his body as he was hung in the gallows. So Bonhoeffer in this quote really talks about the theology of the cross. The last quote also sort of gets at some of the theology of the cross that Bonhoeffer was really inspired by. And so for Bonhoeffer and the death of God theologians, this theology of the cross is paramount for living in ways that enter in the world and that don't escape it. So it would have been easy, especially for someone as wealthy and privileged as Bonhoeffer, to sort of move to America. I mean, he was a German, he was bright, he was brilliant, and he could have easily just lived in his privilege and not had any worry. But he fully entered into the suffering and brokenness of what was going on in his world and experienced it as well, fully experienced it. The famous Death of God theologian William Hamilton once wrote that there are problems and needs, to be sure, but the world itself is a source of solutions, not God. God must be asked to do what the world is fully capable of doing, to offer forgiveness, overcome loneliness, provide a way out of despair, break pride, assure the fear of death. These are worldly problems for those who live in this world, and the world itself can provide the structures to meet them. I don't know if Bonhoeffer would go as far to say that God is not needed in this, in the worldly problems and the worldly solutions. But I would say that Bonhoeffer would agree that we, as humans, especially the Christian, is meant to fully enter into the solutions of the world. That this world, we created these problems in this world, but out of that creating of those problems, we also have capacity to solve them. And therefore we, especially the Christian, is meant to enter into that world fully. So I think the Death of God theologians and Bonhoeffer, although, again, there's really high insistence by the Death of God theologians for there to be the death of God. I don't think Bonhoeffer goes that far. But they both do insist that we are to live as if God does not exist, meaning that we are to find these solutions, to find peace, to find forgiveness, to find the way out of this despair and brokenness. And by doing, how to do that is to fully enter into it, to fully enter into the suffering and brokenness. So again, I don't think Bonhoeffer goes quite as far as what I just read from Hamilton, but you can certainly see the similarities between both. So that's my first approval. I do believe that Bonhoeffer and the Death of God theologians certainly agree that we are to fully enter into this world and not to escape it. That we are to give ourselves, especially the Christian, is to give oneself to this world. So here's the approval number 2. I do believe that Bonhoeffer's concept of religionless Christianity, which my podcast Religionless Church is inspired by, is also fairly approved, or fairly used, rather, by the Death of God theologians. So Hamilton also talks about how if religion is defined as a system that treats God as a problem solver, then both Bonhoeffer and Death of God theologians suggest a religionless Christianity. So if a religion is defined by a system that solely treats God as a problem fixer, as a problem solver, as a sort of deistic way of thinking of God, then both Bonhoeffer and the Death of God theologians suggest we need a religionless Christianity, that religion plays no part in the Christ event. And for those who fully participate in the Christ event, the Christians, we are to find ourselves a system that is void of religion, if that religion is a system that treats God as a problem solver. So without the necessity of Christianity then, because Bonhoeffer is noticing a world of come of age, a world where Christianity no longer is the dominant system, the dominant religion that dominates culturally the world. So Christianity no longer is the necessity, it's no longer the given. Without that necessity, without that given, Christianity has no head starts ontologically or psychologically. It implies that there is no clergy deductions, no tax exemption, and no preferential treatment of any kind. So Bonhoeffer and the Death of Theologians suggest that if there is no necessity of Christianity, then Christianity has no reason to find itself to be privileged in this world. They both describe a Christianity that maintains no privilege. It remains powerless. And because of that, it necessitates a return to its roots of giving itself to the world, just as I suggested earlier. So I think both the Death of God theologians and the Bonhoeffer scholars and Bonhoeffer himself would suggest that if Christianity defined, or if religion defined in a certain way, then Christianity needs to negate itself, to oppose itself, to remain antagonistic to that sort of religious way, and then enter into a system that gives itself to the world. So my hope and my work is to build on this concept of religionless Christianity that both Bonhoeffer and the Death of God theologians explore. And my building on this is to explore certain structures that are already emerging, that I think breed a Christianity that yearns for itself to give itself to the world. I do think that there's ways to structure a system that potential it to give itself to the world. I think there's certain ways of doing that. And as Hamilton suggested, that there would be no clergy reductions, no tax exemptions, no preferential treatment. Those certain things need to be void of a system and a structure if Christianity wants to give itself to the world. So my sort of hope in religionless Christianity is to create systems and structures that will continue to transform Christianity in a way where it will always be giving itself to the world, fully to itself. So that is some of the work that I think Bonhoeffer is doing, and some of the work that the Death of God theologians are doing, and how they're intersecting. So I do think that there are fair critiques of the way that Death of God theologians use Bonhoeffer, but I really do think in a couple ways, as I mentioned, with both of their insistence that we are to give ourselves to the world, and that by doing that, a religionless Christianity sort of emerges. I do think both the Death of God theologians and Bonhoeffer see eye to eye on that, and I do think that the Death of God theologians are using Bonhoeffer correctly in that way. So I hope this has been somewhat instructive. I know it's sort of going everywhere. There's a lot of missing gaps here. This was just a little bit of research that I was doing based on what I know about the Death of God theologians and Bonhoeffer. And so if you find any critique of mine or any critique to me in my analysis of it, be sure to let me know. I'd love to talk about it. And I would like to hear if you found that this was helpful or if this was not. But thank you again for watching. And if you, again, also would like to support me on Patreon, I would certainly be appreciative of that. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day.